Intellectual thinkers in the Continental Congress cited work from Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke with his Life, Liberty, and Property statement, which stressed the importance of individual freedoms and rights. They also cited the idea of a social contract. The government is made up of the people, therefore the government must listen to the people. The British government was not adequately representing the colonists' interests, which became especially apparent with the implementation of taxes and economic acts that were seen as an affront to rights and self-autonomy on the colonists' behalf. With the combined degrading of self-autonomy and rights and the social contract between Britain and its colonies being violated, colonists felt justified in rebelling against their mother country. For decades, the British had tested a policy referred to as salutary neglect in regards to the colonies. As a result of a lack of heavy-handed intervention, self-autonomy flourished as did a number of rights and freedoms. In 1774, Thomas Jefferson remarked that the colonists who came to America came to develop societies that held rights and their own identity in high regard, as a result of a lack of British interference, Doc 3. Again, as a result of that, it became important to colonists that self-autonomy was necessary in forming individual rights and freedoms not seen in Britain. These sentiments of a necessity for rights and freedoms were also shared in the First Continental Congress. Many of the attendees were well versed in Enlightenment thought, and the first point of the resolve makes clear that the need for colonists to have certain unalienable rights that the government cannot take away without their consent. The resolves document cites the necessity of rights, but also has the social contract. This will come later. This was made to address the British government and bring to their attention the lack of respect for individual and basic rights. As demonstrated thus far, rights and freedoms entail respect and admire. However, for the most part, African Americans were not granted these rights. One exception is Boyro Binge, a slave who fought for the British in the French and Indian War and for the Americans in the Revolution. After his tenure, he was freed and could have more rights than he previously received. With the prospect of fighting for his country and being freed from slavery, it became apparent that Binge highly appreciates patriotism, liberty, and freedom. During his freedom, he indulges in all manners of freedoms Americans had gotten used to during salutary neglect. Individual freedoms are generally not a concern until they are endangered. With America, they had been taken for granted during salutary neglect and then lost during the implementation of the Stamp Act, which was seen as an affront to liberty and self-autonomy and gendered threats and violence against tax collectors. The subject of the Americans' ire was the Board of Customs, who were seen as tyrants. Document 7. Basic freedoms, rights, and self-autonomy, which were given indirectly to the colonists, were now being encroached on. Naturally, anger and resentment were spawned and being directed against the government which had originally granted them. Years before the events in the 1760s had transpired, Enlightenment thinkers created the idea of a social contract, that the people made up the government, and in turn the government must protect and keep its constituents happy, or risk retaliation. This idea had spread to the colonies by the 1750s, with one Puritan clergyman, John Mayhew, citing it as a case against unlimited submission to a king that disregards public welfare. Mayhew also calls for a rejection of the British government whenever it would happen. Document 6. Mayhew used her argument for submission to even a tyrannical ruler and turned it into a reason to the opposite, to resist. Again, the belief that the people submit to only a king that respects its citizens' affairs plays into the social contract. Government must respect its citizens, or else citizens will not respect government. After years of heavy-handed intervention in the colonies, citizens began to resent the fact that a king/parliament 3,000 miles away made decisions for them, without their consent. This was the reasoning of J. Warren's Boston Oration. After the end of the French and Indian War, in an effort to raise taxes to pay off debts, Britain sent soldiers to enforce rules when resistance to taxation was high. Consent is a big part of the social contract, and without consent, the colonists were angered that the government was not respecting their affairs. Going back to the Continental Congress of 1774, a need was also outlined for representation and participation of colonial representatives in Parliament. It also refers to consent, which the lack of representation did not lead to, in regards to levying taxes and other policies, Document 4. One of the key reasons for convening the Congress, don't know what that part is. What upset many of the men and colonists was that they had no voice regarding their internal affairs. Again, the lack of consent. As America was getting closer to declaring independence, the social contract prevailed on social matters, not merely economic. Women like Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, were concerned that the potential new government would elevate men at the expense of women. She writes that men in power must remember that women make up the government too, and if their rights are taken away, they will rebel. Document 5. This is a prime example of a social contract being used in regards to sex. Abigail Adams and other women were opposed to patriarchy, which in their minds was an equal replacement to tyranny by the British. Her argument is that if Americans can rebel due to a lack of rights, then women can rebel against patriarchy in the same manner. One example is a passage of a law securing wage laws to protect workers and punishing violations of this law outside of One origin of the mutual dynamic between citizens and government is the foundings of settlements in the north. Governments were made with the intent to serve the people's interest and representing them and making decisions accordingly. Such citizens viewed this as a prime example of the dynamic between citizen and government, unlike Britain. It can be said that it was not Enlightenment philosophies that compelled the colonists to rebel, but merely due to taxation or no representation in regards to said taxes. However, that plays into the hands of the stated argument. It was dissemination of Enlightenment philosophies via sermons, pamphlets, etc., such as Common Sense by Thomas Paine, that led to a common understanding of the relationship between the colonists and Britain being frayed, thus leading to violence. See, I just taught you kids scholarly things, intellectual things. Maybe your parents should go and, maybe take care of you more instead of leaving you to watch stupid kids videos.